It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seemed to slow down and everything was at peace. But for one elderly woman, what seemed like an ordinary night would quickly spiral into a nightmare that no one could have imagined. Imagine being alone, just you and your dog, when suddenly everything changes. The shadows crept in as the moonlight filtered through the window, casting long, eerie shapes across the room. She sat in her favorite armchair, nestled comfortably with a book, her loyal dog resting at her feet. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, but just moments later, everything would shatter because someone had broken into her home. The door burst open with a force that made the entire house tremble. The elderly woman barely had time to react. A man, his face masked and eyes cold, charged toward her. He was after something: money, valuables, or perhaps something darker. She had no idea. All she knew was that her life was now in danger, and no one was around to help her. But what happened next is not what you'd expect. You see, in a world where help often feels too far away, there was one thing, someone she could count on: her dog. This wasn't just any dog. It was a dog that had been with her through thick and thin, through years of joy and sorrow, the kind of bond that words can barely describe. As the attacker drew closer, something incredible happened. The dog, small and seemingly helpless, sprang into action. What happened next defied logic and expectation. It was a display of courage and loyalty that left the elderly woman, the attacker, and anyone who witnessed the events that night stunned. The bond between a person and their dog is often described as unbreakable, but this moment would prove that, sometimes, it can be life-saving. As you listen to the events that unfolded, remember, not all heroes wear capes. Some wear fur, and they fight not for fame or glory, but for those they love. So stay with us as we reveal the shocking twist in this heart-stopping tale of love, survival, and unyielding courage. What happened in the moments after the attack is something you'll never forget. What her dog did next will leave you in tears. The air in the house was thick with the kind of silence that only comes when the world outside is cloaked in darkness. The old woman, Margaret, sat by the fire, the only light flickering softly in the dim room. The shadows stretched long across the walls, making the house feel smaller, more enclosed, like it was holding its breath. Outside, the wind howled faintly, pushing against the windows as if trying to get in. The trees outside bent and creaked under the pressure, their branches scratching at the glass like long, bony fingers. Margaret's dog, a scruffy little terrier named Max, lay at her feet, his small form a quiet presence in the calm of the room. His soft breathing was the only sound besides the crackling of the fire. She reached down to pat his head, comforted by his warmth. After all, he was her only companion now. Her children had grown up and moved far away, and her husband had passed years ago. It was just her and Max, and though they were both getting older, there was a sense of peace in their routine. But tonight, something felt off. Margaret couldn't explain it. There was no reason, no obvious sign. But as she sat there, a chill settled over her. It wasn't from the cold, but something deeper, something unsettling. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, a sensation that crept slowly over her like a shadow inching closer. Max, too, seemed on edge. His ears perked up, his tail stiffening as he looked toward the door. Then it happened. A loud crash from the hallway snapped through the stillness, like a door slamming open with too much force. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, time stood still. She froze, not knowing if she had imagined it or if it was something far worse. Max jumped to his feet, his growl low and menacing, but his stance was defensive, like he knew something that Margaret couldn't see. "Who's there?" Margaret called, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if it was fear or just instinct that made her speak out, but she could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. The house was quiet again, but it was a silence that was far more dangerous than before. Someone was out there, and it was coming for her. Margaret Miller had always been a woman of resilience. At 76, she was a product of a generation that had lived through wars, hardships, and the slow passage of time. Her hands, though frail with age, had once been strong. They had worked tirelessly, mending clothes, baking bread, and tending to the garden. They had cradled children, comforted sick family members, and held the hand of a dying husband. Her life had been one of constant giving, of love, labor, and selflessness. But now, in the twilight of her years, it seemed that giving was no longer enough to fill the emptiness of her days. Her husband, Harold, had passed away nearly 5 years ago after a long battle with illness. She still remembered the sound of his cough in the early mornings, the way he would smile at her from his favorite chair by the window, even as his strength slowly drained away. It had been a slow and painful goodbye, one that left Margaret with a sense of loss that was impossible to ignore. Their children, grown and with families of their own, had visited less and less as the years went on. Margaret understood. Life moved on, and they had their own responsibilities, but it didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. It was a heavy silence that filled the house now. The laughter of children, the hum of conversation over dinner, the sound of Harold's chair scraping against the floor, those things had all become distant memories. All she had now was the company of her dog, Max. He was a small, scruffy terrier with a heart as big as his bark. Margaret had adopted him after Harold passed, a decision she hadn't regretted for a moment. Max had been a source of comfort, his presence a constant reminder that not all was lost. He filled the house with warmth, even if he could be a bit mischievous at times. Despite his small stature, Max had an unshakable loyalty to Margaret. His sharp eyes and attentive ears were always on alert, his senses more attuned to danger than anyone could have expected. It was as if he had an unspoken understanding of what it meant to protect, and every day, he stood by Margaret's side as her faithful companion. Margaret often found herself sitting in the same armchair by the fire, gazing out the window into the darkened world beyond. She didn't fear the solitude, but sometimes, the weight of it pressed down on her chest like an invisible hand. Her mind often wandered to the days when she and Harold would take long walks in the park, or when they would sit on the porch watching the stars. It wasn't that she was dissatisfied with her life. It was simply the reality of aging that made her reflect on the past. Time was a cruel thing, slipping away from her, leaving her with more questions than answers. But Max had always been there, and though he could never replace the love she had lost, his companionship brought a quiet joy to her heart. The day of the attack began just like any other. Margaret had finished her morning tea, set about her chores, and then settled down for a quiet afternoon in her chair. Max had been lying at her feet, content to doze off as she read her book. For a while, everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. Margaret had the sense that time was moving slower than usual, the hours dragging on like the ticking of an old clock. It was in those rare moments of stillness that Margaret's mind would drift to darker thoughts. She couldn't help but wonder how much longer she had, how much more time she would be able to enjoy the little things. She wasn't afraid of death. No, that was not what troubled her. What bothered her was the idea of leaving things unfinished, of not being there for her children and grandchildren in the way she wished she could be. The idea of growing old alone had started to gnaw at her, but there was nothing she could do about it. She had to accept that this was her reality. And yet, as much as Margaret longed for a sense of purpose, there was something within her that still refused to succumb to despair. She was strong in her own quiet way, When the world seemed to have turned its back on her, she would stand tall, even if only in her own mind. There was a fire inside her that refused to go out, a resolve that still flickered, even on the coldest days. That was the Margaret who was about to face an unimaginable threat. The Margaret who would fight with all her strength, not for herself, but for the one living being who had become her world, Max. As the attack unfolded, the cold fear that crept into her chest was nothing compared to the surge of adrenaline that overtook her when she saw the figure in the doorway. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending Max, the one creature who had never stopped loving her unconditionally. In that moment, something inside her shifted. All of the years of quiet suffering, all of the long nights spent alone, all of the heartache. It didn't matter. This was a fight for survival. Max, who had always been by her side, now became her protector in a way that neither of them had ever expected. The dog, small and unassuming, had always been content to lie at her feet or chase after a ball. But now, as the intruder moved closer, he stood between Margaret and the danger, his growl a low, steady warning. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly alive. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment, everything became clear. Max wasn't just her dog. He was her family, her defender, her reason to fight. And together, they would face whatever came next. The silence of the house, which had once been a comfort, now felt oppressive. After the crash from the hallway, Margaret stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. Her heart thudded painfully against her chest, each beat a loud reminder that something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Max's growl was low, the kind of growl that made Margaret's skin prickle with unease. The dog's small body was tense, his ears flat against his head, eyes trained on the hallway beyond the door. He didn't bark, he didn't need to. Max was the kind of dog that always sensed trouble before anyone else. Margaret knew he wouldn't back down, but as the seconds ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. "Max?" Margaret whispered, her voice shaky. Max didn't respond. He was too focused. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she carefully rose from her armchair, her legs shaky beneath her. She had to do something. But what? She didn't know where the intruder was, or how many of them there were. And no matter how many times she told herself it was just a burglar, some part of her feared it was more than that. Something darker, something she couldn't quite place. With one hand gripping the arm of the chair for balance, Margaret edged toward the hallway. The house felt different now, as though the walls were closing in on her. Max's growl continued, deeper now, rising in pitch as if to warn her of something coming closer. Then, suddenly, the door slammed open. Margaret barely had time to react as a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark ski mask, rushed toward her. His movements were fast, fluid, like he'd done this before. His eyes, barely visible beneath the mask, locked onto hers with cold intent. He wasn't here for money, Margaret realized with a sickening certainty. This wasn't a robbery. This was something far more terrifying. "Give me your keys," he growled, voice muffled but harsh. Margaret's blood ran cold, and for a split second, she froze. The words barely made sense in her mind. But then instinct kicked in. She stepped back, her hand reaching toward the table beside her, grabbing a heavy candlestick for defense. But before she could even raise it, Max lunged. The dog's small body collided with the man's legs with surprising force. It wasn't enough to knock him down, but it was enough to make the man stumble, his eyes widening in sudden confusion. "Get off me!" he shouted, shaking the dog away with one hand. But Max wasn't done. He wasn't going to back down, not when Margaret was in danger. The attacker took a step back, fumbling for something hidden beneath his jacket. And in that moment, Margaret knew she couldn't wait. She had to act. The man turned just as she swung the candlestick with all her might. It struck his arm, but the force of the blow wasn't enough to stop him. He growled, his eyes narrowing. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife. The glint of steel under the dim light made Margaret's stomach drop. Her heart raced as the man lunged forward, the blade coming dangerously close to her face. But then Max barked. The sharp, piercing sound broke through the air like a warning bell, and without thinking, the dog launched himself at the man's leg again, biting down hard. The attacker cursed, stumbling back, shaking his leg violently to try and dislodge Max's teeth from his pants. Margaret took this moment to back away, her mind racing for any way out. She couldn't fight him off, not with her strength. But Max was her lifeline. "Help!" Margaret screamed, hoping against hope that someone would hear her. But the wind outside howled louder, drowning out her cries. The attacker was furious now. He turned on Max, kicking the dog across the room. Max yelped in pain but quickly got back to his feet, his eyes full of fury and determination. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she saw the dog struggle to stay on his feet. He was small, but he was brave, and he wouldn't let her down. In a blind panic, Margaret grabbed her phone from the table. Her hands shook as she dialed the police, but the phone didn't even ring before the intruder snatched it from her grasp. He turned it off, throwing it across the room in frustration. "You think anyone's coming for you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "No one's gonna help you. You're all alone." Margaret's pulse raced as she faced him, the man closing the gap with every second. She could hear the sound of his footsteps in the silence of the room, each one heavier than the last. But as the man moved closer, Max found new strength. With a sudden burst of energy, the dog attacked again, charging the man's legs, biting at his ankles, and throwing him off balance. Margaret's mind raced. She had to do something. There was no time to waste. She couldn't fight him alone, but Max was her strength. He had proven it already. "Max, no!" she shouted. Her voice panicked as she saw the dog retreat. But Max wasn't backing down. He didn't care about the odds or the size of the man. He only cared about Margaret's safety. He let out another deep growl and lunged forward again, his small body colliding with the man's knee. This time, the intruder fell. Margaret didn't waste another second. Her heart pounded in her chest, her instincts guiding her as she moved toward the fallen man. The candlestick was still in her hand, and with a swift motion, she raised it above her head and brought it crashing down onto the man's arm, forcing him to drop the knife. The intruder screamed in pain, clutching his arm as he tried to scramble back to his feet. Margaret's breath was ragged, but she didn't stop. She stood tall, holding the candlestick with trembling hands, eyes locked onto the attacker. Her fear had transformed into something else now, determination, defiance. She wasn't going to let him take her life. She wasn't going to let him win. Max stood beside her, tail straight and eyes sharp, ready to fight to the end. The intruder, realizing the fight wasn't in his favor anymore, scrambled back toward the door, clutching his bleeding arm. He stumbled toward the exit, muttering curses under his breath, but it was clear he wasn't going to try anything else. As the door slammed shut, Margaret stood still, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. Her body shook with adrenaline, her heart racing, but she didn't let herself collapse. Max trotted over to her, nudging her hand with his nose. His small body was covered in scratches, but his spirit was unbroken. Margaret knelt down to him, tears welling up in her eyes. "You saved me, Max. You really saved me." Max licked her hand, as if in acknowledgement. The bond between them had been tested in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. But it was a bond that could never be broken. In that moment, Margaret knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Together, she and Max had overcome something unimaginable, and that was a strength she would carry with her forever. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on Margaret like an unseen weight. Her heart, still racing from the confrontation, refused to slow. She glanced nervously around the room, her eyes darting toward every shadow as though expecting the intruder to appear again. Max, her ever-loyal companion, was at her side, but even he seemed uneasy, his tail lowered, his ears flicking toward every small sound. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows. The storm had been building since evening, a fierce, relentless force that seemed to mirror the chaos inside the house. But it wasn't the storm that unsettled Margaret. No, it was the eerie silence that followed the man's departure. The emptiness of a house that had once been full of life. Had he really gone? Margaret's mind raced with questions, but none of the answers felt right. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished yet. Her instincts screamed that danger was still lurking just outside the door. As the minutes dragged on, she found herself walking to the window and peering through the heavy curtains. The street outside was empty. No sign of the intruder, no sound of footsteps. But why did she feel so unsettled? The flickering light from the hallway lamp seemed to stretch unnaturally long, casting a shadow that danced on the wall like a specter. She swallowed hard, stepping away from the window as she turned her attention back to Max. The dog, usually so brave, had his back to her, his body tense as he growled softly. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog's growl deepened, a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It was unlike anything Margaret had ever heard before. This wasn't the playful bark of her dog warning a stranger. It was the sound of a creature that sensed something far more dangerous. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the room, trying to make sense of the strange energy that had settled in her home. The storm raged outside, but inside, the house was still, almost too still. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the candlestick, still in her grasp from the earlier fight. It was a small weapon, but right now it felt like her only lifeline. Max's growl faded into a tense silence, and Margaret felt it. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. She turned, slowly, her eyes scanning every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to shift and move, as if something was there, hiding just beyond the reach of the light. Her pulse quickened. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible creak from the hallway. Margaret froze. She wasn't sure if it was the wind or the house settling, but the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Another creak, louder this time. "Max?" she whispered, but the dog remained still, his head low, eyes locked on the door. Margaret's throat tightened. What if he hadn't left? What if he was waiting outside, watching her just like before? The thought sent a shiver of dread down her spine. Max's eyes flicked toward the door as if on cue. Then the door handle turned. It was subtle, just a slight movement, but enough to make Margaret's stomach drop. No, 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 no. Her pulse surged, the blood in her veins turning cold as she took a step back, clutching the candlestick tighter. Her breath came faster now, shallow and panicked. The handle turned again, more forcefully this time. Whoever was on the other side wasn't trying to sneak in, they were trying to get in. Max was already moving before Margaret could react. The dog darted toward the door, barking fiercely, his small body slamming into the wood with all the force he could muster. His barks grew louder, more frantic, as he tried to shove the door open. But it wasn't just Max who was rattled. Margaret's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She knew the man had been injured. She had seen the blood on his arm. But if he was still out there, then the stakes had escalated beyond what she could have imagined. This wasn't just an intruder now. This was a man with something to prove. Another series of knocks shook the door, followed by a muffled voice on the other side. It was low, almost a whisper, but Margaret heard it clearly. "Let me in. I'm not done yet." Her blood ran cold. The voice didn't sound like the man from before. It was different, deeper, somehow more sinister. The words sent a chill straight through her bones. It was like a warning. But what exactly was it warning her about? Margaret swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Her hand trembled as she reached for the lock, but she knew she had to stay calm. She couldn't let fear control her. Not now. But it was getting harder. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to protect herself from whatever was lurking just beyond the door. A flash of light caught her attention, drawing her gaze to the hallway mirror. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, but then she saw it. A figure standing just out of view. For a moment, she thought it was her reflection. But as she squinted, she realized it was someone else. A figure in the shadows. Her heart stopped. The figure was tall, thin, with a hunched posture that made it appear almost skeletal. Its face was hidden, shrouded by darkness, but there was something about it. Something so wrong, so unnatural, that it made her blood run cold. She turned away, her eyes wide with panic. This wasn't just an intruder. This was something far worse. She felt the hairs on her neck prickle as she turned back to the door, gripping the candlestick with all her might. A shadow passed by the window, momentarily blocking the dim light. Who was out there? Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had to do something, but the uncertainty and fear were paralyzing. Max was barking furiously, but the dog seemed to sense something she couldn't see. His ears pinned back, his body trembling. With her heart pounding in her chest, Margaret backed away slowly, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the storm outside. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch further, their edges curling and twisting like the fingers of a phantom. A gust of wind howled through the house, rattling the windows once again, but the sound wasn't as comforting as before. This time, it felt like a warning, like the wind itself was whispering to her, urging her to escape before it was too late. Max stopped barking suddenly, his body still as he stood by her side. For a moment, everything was eerily quiet, but then, there it was, a faint scraping sound, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. The danger was already here, and it was closing in. The pounding of Margaret's heart echoed in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. The footsteps drew closer, each one deliberate, heavy, as if the person outside was savoring the fear that gripped her. Her mind raced, every thought a blur, as she desperately searched for a way out, a way to protect herself. But all she could focus on was the growing presence that lingered just outside her door, the suffocating sense of dread that had settled over the house. Max stood rigid beside her, his eyes fixed on the door, his low growl vibrating through the air. The once comforting sound of the storm outside now felt oppressive, like nature itself was a spectator to the nightmare unfolding within these walls. Margaret's gaze flicked toward the window once more, her fingers tightening around the candlestick. The figure she had seen in the hallway mirror was still there, still lingering just out of reach, like a dark promise of terror. A knock came again, but this time it was different, soft, almost too soft, as if the man outside had given up on trying to force his way in. Margaret held her breath, listening, waiting for another movement. The silence stretched, and just when she thought her heart might burst from the pressure, the door creaked. The lock rattled. The handle turned again. This time, she didn't wait. Her pulse surged as she stepped forward, gripping the candlestick with trembling hands, her body on alert. She couldn't let him in. She wouldn't let him take her. The door opened just a crack, the man's face finally emerging into the dim light. His skin was pale, his expression twisted into something both pathetic and dangerous. Blood stained his clothes, his arm, dripping onto the floor in dark crimson stains. But what shocked Margaret the most were his eyes, wide, wild, unblinking. They were filled with a madness that she hadn't seen before, a desperation that sent a chill down her spine. "Please," the man rasped, his voice barely audible over the storm. I didn't mean to. I just needed help." Margaret recoiled, the words hanging in the air like a trap. The man's pleading voice should have been a sign of weakness, but it wasn't. It was the sound of something much darker, a plea that came from someone who had nothing left to lose. She felt a wave of revulsion wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp, gut-wrenching fear. Was he the same man who had attacked her earlier? Was he the one who had come back, more dangerous than before, now looking for something more than just a fight? Max's growl cut through her thoughts. The dog's body was low, his teeth bared in a warning that only Margaret understood. The man took a step forward, but before he could move any closer, Max lunged, his teeth sinking into the intruder's leg. The man screamed in pain, stumbling backward as Max tore at him with all the fury of an animal protecting its territory. Margaret didn't think. She just acted. With a single swing of the candlestick, she struck him across the back, the blow making a sickening thud as it connected. The man cried out, more from shock than from the pain. He stumbled further back, his face contorting into a snarl. "You're not getting away with this," Margaret said, her voice cold, despite the trembling of her hands. She didn't know if it was courage or desperation that fueled her words, but in that moment, she couldn't think of anything else but surviving. The man, his face twisted in anger and disbelief, staggered back and swung his arm at Max, knocking the dog aside. Max yelped in pain but quickly regained his footing, ready to defend his owner. Margaret's heart clenched as she watched the dog struggle against the man's violent retaliation. The dog was smaller, weaker, but his loyalty was unmatched. The man turned his attention back to Margaret, his eyes filled with madness and fear. He didn't see Max charging at him again, this time with more force, more purpose. Margaret, still holding the candlestick, felt a rush of adrenaline surge through her veins. She could see the fear in the man's eyes, and for the first time, she realized he wasn't just dangerous because of his actions, but because of his utter lack of humanity. He was a man broken by whatever torment had driven him to this point, and that made him more unpredictable than any killer she had ever imagined. In a split second, the man lunged toward her. Margaret screamed and brought the candlestick up just in time, striking him in the face. His head snapped back, blood splattering across the floor. He stumbled, his hands reaching for her. But Max was there, leaping onto him with an unexpected ferocity. The man's scream was deafening as he fell to the floor, the dog's teeth tearing into his flesh with an almost animalistic determination. Margaret, breathless and trembling, staggered back, her mind struggling to comprehend the violence unfolding before her. She didn't know how much longer Max could keep this up. He was smaller than the man, but he was relentless. The fight continued, the room filled with the sound of heavy breathing, the crunch of bones, the sickening noise of a struggle for survival. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity as Margaret watched helplessly, unsure whether she was witnessing her dog's last stand or her own. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the man went limp. Max stopped, his teeth still clamped down on the man's leg. But now there was only silence. Margaret's chest heaved as she looked down at the lifeless body of the man who had terrorized her. Her hands were still shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. Max whined softly at her side, his head low, his eyes filled with a quiet exhaustion. Margaret fell to her knees, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. She didn't know how long she stayed there, staring at the body of the man who had tried to take everything from her. Her thoughts were jumbled, her emotions raw. She should feel relief. She should feel victorious. But all she felt was an overwhelming sadness. She reached down and stroked Max's head, her fingers trembling against his fur. The dog nuzzled her hand, as if reassuring her, and she couldn't help but smile through the tears that began to spill down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." The storm outside had quieted, but the storm inside her remained. She had survived, but she knew that life would never be the same. The darkness that had entered her home had left its mark, and though she had fought back with everything she had, it was Max, the brave, loyal dog who had saved her. And in that moment, Margaret realized the depth of the bond they shared. It wasn't just love. It was something far deeper, something that transcended even the darkest of moments. As the wind settled and the house grew still once more, Margaret looked out the window. The world was quiet now. The terror had passed. But she knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, she and Max would face it together. Margaret sat in the dim light of the living room, her fingers gently stroking Max's fur as the dog rested beside her. The house was quiet now, the storm having passed and the silence feeling almost unnatural after the chaos that had unfolded. The terrifying encounter, the man who had threatened everything she held dear, had left her shaken but stronger. She had survived not by mere luck, but through sheer determination and the courage that came from having something, or rather someone, worth protecting. Max, his breathing slow and steady, lay peacefully next to her, his eyes half closed, as though he too had found some semblance of peace. In that quiet moment, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on what had transpired. The attack, the fear, the near helplessness she'd felt when confronted with a threat that seemed unstoppable. It all felt so distant now, but in reality it had changed her. She was different. She had learned, perhaps the hardest way, that courage doesn't come from being fearless. It comes from facing the darkest moments head-on and fighting with everything you have, even when you're terrified. That bravery, that strength, had come from the most unlikely of sources, Max. The dog who had stood beside her not just as a pet, but as a protector, a friend, a true partner. In his unwavering loyalty, Margaret had discovered something profound. The bond between them was unbreakable. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the world may seem, there is always light in those who stand by your side. But the terror had also revealed something deeper about humanity. The man who had attacked her, broken, lost, was a reflection of how far someone could go when consumed by desperation and madness. It made Margaret wonder, how many people in the world were like him, trapped in their own struggles, fighting for survival in ways that might never be understood by others? It was a question that lingered, unanswered, as she gazed out the window into the now calm night. Margaret's journey had been about survival, yes, but it was also about understanding the value of those moments when we feel truly connected to another being, whether human or animal. She had been forced to confront the darkest side of humanity, but it was the love and loyalty she shared with Max that had shown her the light. As she looked down at the dog who had saved her life, her heart swelled with gratitude. She had come face to face with a nightmare, but Max had turned it into a testament of love, sacrifice, and the power of true companionship. No longer was she just a woman in a house. She was someone who had fought, and won with the most incredible ally she could ever ask for. And though the storm had passed, Margaret knew the true storm had always been within. But now it was calm, because she had found her strength, not just in herself, but in the love of a dog who had never once doubted her. If you were moved by Margaret and Max's story, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think this story teaches us about loyalty and courage in the face of fear? Can you relate to the bond between them, or do you have predictions for what might happen next? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss a new video. We've got more gripping, emotional stories coming your way, and we'd love for you to be part of our community. Join us for the next chapter. Thank you for watching, and remember, the most unexpected heroes can emerge when we least expect it.